Let's begin with Charlotte today. For non-members or visitors of the day, Charlotte Gardes-Landolfini is an expert in the fields of climate change, energy, and financial stability. Her experience has greatly contributed to understanding the intersection between climate risk and the financial sector. She's currently a member of the Monetary and Capital Market Department at the International Monetary Fund. Charlotte, it's great to see you again, and thanks for your continued support to the good work of Green RWA. We value your help very much. And the mic is yours to provide an update on IMF and share your climate perspective.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Can you hear me well?
Yeah, all good.
Okay, great. Thank you. I'm supposed to share my screen, but the window does not appear. So let me see. All right, that's weird. Sorry about that. My PowerPoint is open. Yeah, here we go. Okay. Can you see the PowerPoint?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you. Very nice to be with you today. So indeed, I work on climate change, climate finance policy, and climate risk at the IMF. And I'm going to present to you just the top 3 sustainability issues that I foresee for the financial sector in 2023 and the connections with IMF work. I'll go pretty quick on most of the slides because I only have 10 minutes, but it's broadly to give you that overview of what we do and what we think would be relevant for the financial sector to look at primarily over the next few months. So first, how do you finance the transition of carbon-intensive economies here and abroad, especially in an energy crisis context? I think it's very much important to recall, and the president of the International Energy Agency actually did so today on the social media and in a recent IEA report, recall that the total debt of fossil fuel companies has actually increased very much since the Paris Agreement. We've seen a substitution from bond to loans, actually. So banks are heavily financing new projects and existing projects for fossil fuels throughout the world. And only 5% of the capex of fossil fuel companies has been dedicated to renewable and clean energy over the past 10 years, including European fossil fuel companies. So we see that despite the whole development of sustainable debt issuance, and this across the world, I mean, not just in Europe, in the Americas, in Asia, in Latin America, we see that there's still a significant increase of investment in fossil fuel capacity. And the investment actually in the low carbon sector, and I'm saying sector as a whole because that includes battery storage, electricity grids, renewable power, is actually falling short of targets very much. And this is what you can see on the right-hand slide here. Per annum, we would need what you can see with a green bar on the right-hand side, and we're barely at half of it as of now. This is all the more concerning because climate change is actually impacting energy security as well. And this is something that is not, I think, very well known and very much discussed, especially since the energy security topic has gained traction since the beginning of the Ukraine war. This is a chart that I directly took from the IEA also that published a report on climate resilience and energy security a few months ago. And ironically enough, actually, climate change is even impacting fossil fuel extraction. Climate change is impacting critical minerals extraction, power production, including in the renewable sector. We think of hydropower and nuclear, but it goes beyond that, including for solar panels, including for wind turbines, and it's impacting electricity networks. So it's all the more relevant as well to substantially mitigate the effects of climate change because climate change is having an impact on energy supply itself. And I think this is something really important to have in mind. So in this context, it's obviously really complex to finance the redirection of the energy sector. Most studies would show that 70% roughly of the investment needs for the low carbon transition, both in advanced economies and in emerging markets, developing economies, would actually go to the power sector, given it's so central to all sectors of our economies, obviously. So that leads to a series of questions. How do you distinguish in your financial sector policies? How do you distinguish also in terms of financial instruments you can mobilize existing, new, and retiring oil and gas assets? We're barely talking about the retiring oil and gas assets, but this is something really very much important, including actually in the short term from a legal and reputational perspective. We have to solve the climate investment trap in emerging markets, developing economy, where the cost of capital is actually super high compared to what we're seeing in advanced economies. And we need to incorporate the phase out of the fossil fuels in transition plans and in net zero commitments. That shouldn't be an impediment to actually finance the transition and the phase out from fossil fuels, and this all across the world. So to what extent is it related to our work? Actually, it's very much central to the work of the IMF, given the IMF has a lending capacity, as you know, also policy advice capacity, and the IMF does surveillance. Its mission is to preserve global financial stability. So each country goes through a stress test of its financial system, and this pretty much frequently. And so now we have climate change that has been incorporated in surveillance, for instance. And so we need to adapt that surveillance to country specificities, and the role of fossil fuels in the economy is obviously one of them. Also, we do a lot of work around what we call the climate information architecture, the fact that you need climate-related data and disclosures from corporates and financial institutions to be able to adapt financial regulation and supervision to all of that, but also to ensure there is transition planning in the financial sector. And the issue of transition plans for banks, as we very much have discussed recently, actually with Green RWA, is a hot one, let's say, in the regulatory sphere. We are working very actively within the Network for Greening the Financial System, the Financial Stability Board, but also the Basel Committee for Banking Supervision to integrate transition plans in prudential regulation. And transition plans for banks must look at fossil fuel exposures, obviously, on balance sheet and off balance sheet exposures. It's very much related to IMF work because we look at the connection between the national climate policies, the long-term strategies, and also the nationally determined contributions. And we do so connecting those national climate policies with the climate alignment methodologies that need to be developed for the financial sector. It's also very much a concern, especially when it comes to retiring oil and gas assets, but also how to phase out fossil fuels while scaling up renewable energy, because we need to identify what is the scale of additional investment versus the scale of reallocation of investment to be able also to have the most impactful reform measures in the countries where the IMF is present, and also to be able to lend the relevant amount of money to actually phase out fossil fuels and scale up renewable energy. So this is very much central to our work. A second topic, which is very much related to what I was talking about previously, is the climate financing gap. You've all heard of the fact that we've hit actually a record in 2022 when it comes to sustainable debt issuance, but and we've seen, of course, a decrease in 2022 compared to previous levels, but still this has hit a record, and actually 2023 is picking up in terms of sustainable debt issuance, despite the banking turmoil that happened in March this year. But we see that in emerging markets, developing economies, actually, there are signs of weaknesses, and that's obviously related to the whole environment in financial markets right now, which is not, let's say, the best for emerging market developing economy issues. But yet we see a lot of innovation in the field when it comes to new types of sustainable debt instruments, and also to sovereign bond issuance, sovereign sustainable bond issuance, that has very much increased, including in emerging markets developing economies. But even though we see that the climate financing gap is huge, not to say abyssal, actually, and just to spend 5 seconds on this slide, what you have to remember is that the gray color on the left-hand side and the orange salmon-ish color on the right-hand side are the gap in terms of climate financing by 2030, if you want to achieve those goals all across emerging markets, developing economies. So except in the Asia-Pacific region, where we've seen an increase over the past few years and more private money coming in the rest of the world, this is close to zero, which is very much a concern, including for climate change adaptation. So in this context, and this is also something that you've probably seen if you're interested in international climate finance, we see that multilateral development banks have a much bigger role to play. These charts are directly extracted from the Global Financial Stability Report of the IMF, which we published a few months ago, and where we showed that MDB is actually crowded private finance of about only 1.2 times the resources they commit themselves. So there needs to be much more de-risking done, much more equity investment done, much more risk-taking also by multilateral development banks in order to reach these goals and actually crowd in the amount of private finance that we need to achieve those shifting the trillions goals, let's say. There's also a role for the IMF, and we have launched, for instance, a new lending capacity called the Resilience and Sustainability Trust, which adds up to previous IMF debt programs in order to include those reform measures on climate within debt conditionality and be able actually to also pursue some technical assistance for these countries to actually pursue the reforms to attract private climate finance in the energy sector, but also in financial regulation and supervision. So there is a series of innovative financial instruments that you can mobilize. There needs to be much more public-private risk-sharing role in this area, and we need to develop the complementarity between the carbon pricing policies and the non-pricing policies as well. And there is a lot of research and then application that the IMF does in this area as well. On the RST, it's something that you'll probably hear also a lot about, especially with the Paris summit coming up end of June on the new global financial pact. The RST is the Resilience and Sustainability Trust, as I was explaining earlier. It started to be operationalized just a few months ago. There are lots of countries down the line that could benefit from the RST, and the RST is solely a climate-oriented lending tool. Also pandemic preparedness, but so far only climate change has been addressed. It's a very long-term maturity loan, 20 years, which is 4 to 5 times more than usually actually implemented IMF loans. And there's a very high also grace period. So highly affordable financing rates for eligible low and middle income countries. But apart from the RST itself and the amount of money that you deploy in order to, let's say, expand that fiscal capacity for emerging markets, developing economy, the IMF uses its policy advice, but also capacity development capacity to be able to assist, let's say, support technically the countries into designing and implementing those reforms as they wish when it comes to climate change. So far we are in the pilot phase. It's a 1-year pilot phase. We have 5 countries, the ones that you can see on the right-hand side of the slide, but we have many more countries in the pipeline that could access the RST in the next few months. And the last but not least topic, which is very much also related to climate change, and I think we cannot stress this enough, there is a very strong climate change and biodiversity nexus. One is not separate from the other, is biodiversity. We're not 3 months now, sorry, we're 6 months from the Global Biodiversity Framework Landmark Agreement that was adopted in Montreal in December last year. And this is very much to have in mind because biodiversity collapse is an endogenous source of macro financial risk. The financial sector directly contributes to biodiversity collapse, and biodiversity collapse has a direct impact on the financial sector. All the more so because biodiversity and the ecosystem services it provides are mainly not substitutable. So that means that you cannot replace natural capital with labor or human capital in most cases. So we need to preserve biodiversity and what's left of it in the next decades. And this is actually something very much important even for human survival and for the state of our economies in the financial sector. So there is also a phenomenal role that biodiversity and ecosystems play in carbon sequestration and climate regulation, which is one of the ecosystem services that biodiversity actually plays and provides humanity. So this is something really much important as well that the IMF is increasingly working on, especially because just to give you one number, 15 of the 17 mega diverse countries on Earth, so the countries that, let's say, host the most biodiversity, just to simplistically define that, are actually emerging markets and developing economies and low-income countries. So we need to preserve biodiversity also for that reason. If we were to achieve the targets of the COP15 agreement that has been adopted in December last year in Montreal, that would mean a substantial shift of our economies, especially when it comes to the phase out of harmful subsidies for biodiversity in the agricultural sector, also in the mining sector, for instance, when it comes to the mobilization of additional finance for biodiversity and also to the conservation and management of 30% at least of the world's lands, inland waters, coastal areas, and oceans. So these targets must be as well known as the Paris Agreement temperature targets. So there are obviously numerous challenges for the financial sector to tackle this. We have done a lot of work in that area, including within the network for greening the financial system. I won't go into detail because I think the 10 minutes have passed already. Just be aware that the NGFS, also the IMF, are very much working on this topic to integrate biodiversity into the financial sector policy work that we do every day and how we support countries with this. I'll stop here because I cannot see you and stop sharing my slides. And I hope that was helpful. Thank you so much.
That was super informative and super helpful. Thank you very much, Charlotte. And it's interesting to see how differently you present the efforts on investing in oil versus solar or renewables against what the international agency announced a couple of days ago. The fact that for the first time solar was over oil in terms of investment, but there's still a long way to go. Or even though the curves crossed. Are there any? We have a couple of minutes for a question or two here. If anybody has one, please raise your hand or just go ahead and speak. If not, I have one, of course. I've got a question myself, Charlotte, on Asia Pacific, and this relates to the remark that Walid gave me yesterday on the that a lot of people from Asia were coming and visit our site, Green RWA website, and the green finance is potentially much more active than what we tend to think in Europe, and I would like to get your perspective on that and how involved they are today in climate finance.
No, of course. Actually, I mean, of course, there's been a lot done in Europe on the regulatory side, especially with a focus on disclosures, as you very well know, which has been the primary lever on which the European Union has decided to act, right? But across the world, sometimes different perspectives are taken. I mean, the fact that you need to develop climate-related data disclosures, it's a given for like pretty much every country. But sometimes central banks, especially because they're in charge of regulation in those countries, actually do innovate, and I think much more than in Europe, including on the prudential regulatory side. I mean, we've seen countries in Latin America, countries in Asia actually moving forward on these issues. So in the Asia-Pacific region, I mean, a lot is being done in terms of how do you integrate, again, how do you build that climate information architecture on the data disclosure side. Pretty much, I mean, there's China, there's Japan, India, Southeast Asia are actually developing those regulations, including taxonomies. Actually, you have plenty of them in Asia now, and they're all like interrelated most of the time. You have a lot being done into on integrating, climate into stewardship codes, for instance, and this is something very much important in Japan, considering their own financial regulatory framework. You have also sovereign sustainable bond issuance that has been developing very much in the Asia Pacific, even excluding China. Actually, there is even Hong Kong, I think, that issued recently a tokenized, sustainable bonds, so sovereign sustainable bonds. So a bit of innovation also in this area. And on biodiversity, there's a lot done as well in terms of, for instance, integrated biodiversity in mandatory transition plans for corporates. In India, the Reserve Bank of India actually is also tackling greenwashing with very specific definitions of green debt securities that go much beyond actually what the European Union even is doing, but perhaps in a much more simple way as well. So there is not this, everlasting debate on the type of funds or whatever. So very different approaches, I think, in lots of areas, but a lot of dynamism as well. And I think this is something that is not looked at enough for sure in Europe, for instance. I mean, at least when I myself was in Europe, I was not paying attention to that when I think we should, right? So that's very much important. In the NGFS, for instance, the Network for Greening Financial System, we've discussed together, on transition planning for financial institutions. I mean, we have very, very accurate, I think, interventions from like central banks in Southeast Asia, in Indonesia, in Thailand, in Australia. I mean, in countries in the Asia Pacific region that I think we barely hear about when we're in Europe, and actually that hold most of the time more ambitious, let's say, positions in this field than even like the European Central Bank or some other European central banks. So I think it's also important to have that in mind.
Thank you very much, Charlotte. And I know you are very busy with so feel free to
it's morning time for me, yes.
I'll stay around, and we'll move on to the second part of our
Thank you so much.
webinar now. Thank you, Charlotte.